Hi, Dr. Robertson here. In this video, I want to talk to you about outlining. I like to think of outlining as imposing order onto your thoughts. Generally speaking, when you come up with an idea or a set of ideas, as long as those ideas are in your head, they're chaotic, they're ephemeral, they're in constant state of flux, they're extremely disorganized. In order for those thoughts to be useful, you have to put them into text. In fact, there are some people who think that you're not even really thinking clearly until you get your thoughts into some form where they can be manageable, whether that's speaking or writing. But just because you put a thought down on paper or just because you've put a thought into text, that doesn't mean that the thought is now organized. Sometimes what we're doing while we're writing is thinking through our ideas. As we're watching them being transformed into text, we're actually interacting with what we put down. And so, even as we're writing, our ideas are going to be in a constant state of flux. As we see something, we think, oh, no, I'd like to maybe state that this way, or that's not really what I'm getting at, or I don't know where this is going. One way to impose order on those thoughts is through outlining. So there are two basic ways that most people approach writing. Some people are immediately going to start planning. If you know you've got a writing assignment you've got to do, and you have all of these ideas that are jumping around in your head, some people are going to plan them out. That's the first thing that they want to do. They want some kind of an organization imposed upon their thoughts before they even really start writing. We call these planners, right? In this approach, you want some kind of an order before you even get started writing. In fact, putting your thoughts into order is your first step in writing. You want to plan out the writing and you want to write according to that plan. So, following the plan is almost like filling in the blanks. Uh, for many writers who like to have that plan in place before they start writing, they're going to use an outline schematic in order to organize their thoughts. And then once they start writing, they just start fleshing out whatever that plan is. Now, this doesn't mean that the plan remains static. The truth is, most planners are going to revise often. And the reason for this is because inspiration happens while you're writing. So, people who think of themselves as planners, this really isn't their identity. It's just a way to feel secure and stable as you get into your writing. You want to know where you're going. But this does not mean that planners aren't open to inspiration. Of course, they're open to inspiration. But what happens is when they get inspiration while they're writing, they're immediately going to go back to their plan and they're going to revise that plan and try to work out again where the inspiration is taking them. And they're going to want to impose order on that inspiration. The thing about planners is that planning takes time. You can't just sit down and hammer out an outline. It's going to require thinking through your ideas and putting them into the outline and figuring out how the pieces fit together. However, the good thing about being a planner is once the plan is done, the writing often happens very quickly. It's not that they don't go back and revise the plan as they're writing the essay. But because they've already got a plan, they know where they're starting, where they're going, and what they need to do in the middle. The writing is often not as laborious as it could be for pantsers. The reason they're called pantsers is because they write by the seat of their pants. They sit down with a blank paper, with a blank page, and they just start writing. Whatever ideas are up in their head, they just put them down on paper, discover the way forward as they go. Now, sometimes pantsers have a vague plan. Sometimes they write it down, sometimes they don't, but they are not married to that plan. The pantser wants the inspiration. That's what they're pursuing. Whereas the planner is on a journey following the map. The pantser is discovering the path as he goes. Now, this doesn't mean that at some point the pantser isn't going to have to impose order. At some point, the pantser is absolutely going to have to impose order on their thoughts. So it's not like planners use outlines and pantsers don't. Pantsers just use outlines at a different stage in the writing process. Usually, after they've written a first draft or maybe even a second draft, once they've got their ideas kind of a little more solid through the writing process, then they have to go in and they have to impose order on what's already there. All right, what are my main ideas? What's the question I'm pursuing or the problem that I'm trying to solve? What is my thesis? All of that for a pantser comes later in the process. But at some point, whether you're a planner or a pantser, you are going to have to impose order on your thoughts. And that's the purpose of outlining. For a pantser, someone who takes a pantser approach, writing often goes through multiple drafts. Pantsers will still revise to the plan, but the plan remains open to fundamental changes as the inspiration strikes. So those are basically two approaches to writing, the two basic approaches to writing. Now, I cannot emphasize this enough. These are approaches and not identities. I've known a lot of novice writers who get into this habit of thinking of themselves as one or the other. Don't think of it that way. Sometimes you'll want to plan stuff out. Sometimes you'll want to write by the seat of your pants. Sometimes both will happen at the same time. You'll start writing by the seat of your pants and immediately start thinking, I got to plan this out. Sometimes you'll start planning stuff out and it will turn into seat of your pants writing. These are approaches to writing. These are not identities. So don't think of yourself as one or the other. Think of them as skills to learn, ways to approach a writing situation. Every writer needs both uh, some experience, some skill in planning, and every writer needs to be open to inspiration. So, within the writing process, let's see where outlining fits. There are a few purposes to outlining. One of the things that's great about outlining is that outlining helps you see how things fit together. So as you're outlining, whether you're a planner or a pantser, this is particularly true in the pantser approach. Once you've got your ideas down, you got to figure out how the different pieces of what you're writing fit together. What are your major themes? What are the major movements in your essay or your story or whatever it might be that you're writing? What outlining allows you to do is focus on those ideas. You get to see them as a schematic rather than them being hidden inside of the style and organization of an essay. So that outline is really important for understanding the big picture ideas that you're trying to get to. In order to communicate well with a reader, the reader needs to see that there's a plan there. They need to see that things have been organized for their benefit. We call that coherence. Global coherence means everything that's there fits. It has a reason for being there. And this is what we mean by imposing order on your thoughts. The audience has to see that this is going somewhere, that everything that's there has a reason for being there. Outlining is how you ensure that happens. So, in sum, the planner's approach, you start with an outline. You write to that plan, you're going to be filling in the blanks. Style, grammar, punctuation, all of that is not of primary importance at the outlining or the planning stage. That will all come later. Uh, A planner doesn't ignore inspiration, but inspiration is not the primary purpose of the plan. The plan is to impose order on your thoughts, the things you've already been inspired with. And as a planner, you're going to have to revisit and revise that plan as necessary. For a pantser, planning is not just out the window. There are a couple of places during the writing process for a pantser where planning comes in handy. Generally, at the very beginning, a pantser will have a very vague idea of where they're going, but they primarily write according to inspiration. What we really mean by inspiration is just that as the ideas come to you, you put them down. And then there's a back and forthness with what's going on to the page. You're seeing it on the page, it's reflecting back into your brain. This works, that doesn't work. And so you're going to be writing and revising kind of as you go, but you just want to get those ideas out. Once those ideas are down, the pantser then has to reread the text. And what they're looking for are patterns, themes, anything that belongs together so that they can then figure out, all right, what are my major themes? What is my thesis statement? Because a lot of times a pantser is not going to know that at the beginning. A pantser will figure out a thesis statement as they go, figure out the sections as they go. But once they've got that down, then you have to impose order. And this is the next part where planning comes in. And this is specifically for a pantser where outlining comes in handy. You will revise by following that plan. And then you, just like a planner, you revisit that plan as necessary. But a plan or a pantser is never going to be as married to their plan as a planner is. So even during the revision process, a pantser may discover something that they really like and they may write it down. They're still going to have to return to that plan and fit that in so that they have that map, that idea map. All right. So now that we've talked about the basics of planning, of outlining, what outlining is for, why we do it, different approaches to it, let's talk about some approaches to outlining itself. And I'm going to teach you 4 basic approaches here. These are not the only ways to approach outlining. These are just 4 that I have seen work and that I have used myself. The first, which we all are probably familiar with, is traditional outlining. You guys have all seen this, right? You start out with a question or a problem, you have a working thesis, and then you outline using Roman numerals by idea or topic or theme, and you just think of your writing in sections. This is the traditional outline. When you sit down to write, you think, okay, I've got one theme or one element or one topic I want to talk about. And then you start planning out essentially paragraphs. What is my first main idea in terms of my topic? What is a claim that I can make about that topic or about that issue or about that theme? Once you've made that claim, you've got to come up with supporting evidence or reasons for that claim. So you make a claim, you come up with reasons for it, you enumerate those reasons, those evidences, and then you move on to the next claim. That is traditional outlining. While traditional outlining has its benefits, it allows you to focus on ideas, it provides a map of the argument. It's a really strong organizational potential, or has really strong organizational potential. There's no clear space management. How many pages is each piece of this going to take? How many paragraphs? How long are these paragraphs going to be? This becomes a problem if you have a specific number of pages that you have to do in an assignment. A lot of novice writers will sit down and they'll plan out an essay, never thinking that I have a 10-page assignment or an 8-page assignment or a 5-page assignment. And to a novice writer, 10 pages sounds like a lot to get through, but it's not really once you start planning it out. If you think about the fact that on an average page, you're going to have anywhere between 1 and 3 paragraphs, depending on the length of the paragraph. And each of those paragraphs is going to require a single claim that you then have to develop. If you sit down and plan out your claims in a regular outline, you may way over plan or way under plan because you're not thinking about the space that you actually have. The other weakness of outlining is because it is so ordered, it's not great for pantsers. And often, as people start writing these kinds of outlines, they'll start writing the essay anyway because inspiration will happen as they're writing it down. So, from my perspective, this kind of outline is generally going to be better later on in the writing process. When I'm first starting, I prefer a different kind of organizational approach. I call this chunking. Chunking is different because it emphasizes space management. Chunking asks you to start out much like traditional outlining, knowing what question or problem you're going to do. By listing potential answers to that, and this is important for both kinds of outlining because listing those potential answers to your questions can give you main points to address later on. So you want to be as exhaustive as you can. And then it asks you to have a working thesis statement. You know, in this essay, I will argue, or in this essay, I am going to explore, or in this essay, I will be suggesting that, something like that. But the difference is that you immediately front load the idea that you have a certain amount of space that you have to fill, and that space is a major constraint on anything that you can say. So look at this example here, this example breakdown. If you have an 8-page assignment and you got your introduction, your body, and your conclusion, once you realize that your introduction is going to take up at least a page, maybe a paragraph or two, your conclusion can take up as much as a page, but may only take up half a page. An 8-page essay suddenly becomes a 5 to 6-page essay almost immediately. How many paragraphs can you feasibly write in 6 pages? Well, maybe 6 if they're really long paragraphs, maybe 10 if some of them are a little bit shorter. Somewhere in that range is what you can fit into a 6 or a 5 into 5 or 6 pages, right? That tells you that you can only make whatever your issue is, whatever your topic is, whatever you're writing about, you can only really make between 6 and 10 claims about it. And then you have to defend those claims. So this is the benefit of chunking, is it forces you to think about the space that you have and to write to that space rather than let the ideas themselves dictate where your essay is going. It forces you to think about the constraints of your writing situation. So this is one of the reasons that I really, really like it. The other reason that I really like it is that it is very useful with organizational schemes. Now we're going to get into organizational schemes a little bit later, but right now I'm going to use an example organizational scheme. This is the classical argument, which I'll discuss shortly. The classical argument structure is usually made up about 5 to 6 stages. And you can see from this example here how easy it is to plan that out. So if I've got an 8-page assignment length, I've got a page for my introduction, half page for my conclusion. That brings me down to about 6 pages for the rest of my essay. Everything else I'm saying in my essay's got to fit into that 6 pages. My narration, or the part where I talk about what other people have said about this topic or this issue, got maybe 2 pages for that. Confirmation, that's where I actually defend my position and develop my position, got maybe 3 or 4 pages for that. But if you think about how many paragraphs that is, that's between 5 and 8 paragraphs. That's not a lot of claims that I can make in order to defend my position. And then I've got to refute other people's claims because I've got to address counter arguments at some point. Total length here is going to be between 7 and 9 pages, and that's a pretty solid target range for a draft of an 8-page essay. So this is an example of how chunking works on the global scale. Let's see what chunking looks like on the local scale in specifics at the specific points of your writing. Generally speaking, when you're going to be chunking, you're going to be looking paragraph by paragraph, section by section, and putting those sections together into a larger, more coherent essay. This is an example of how you might do that. So you think about paragraph structure and you build everything from there. So every paragraph has to have its own claim. Once you realize how many claims you can make, 3 to 4 pages to confirm or to argue your position, that gives you between 3 and 4 paragraphs, maybe 8 paragraphs that you can do. For each paragraph, you then come up with a claim. For each claim, you have to support it somehow. So you need evidence, you need examples, you need reasons for your reader to accept the claim. You might have to analyze some sources that you're using to show how those sources support your claim. You're going to have to probably interpret some of the things that you're explaining and explain some of the things that you're interpreting. Each of these will require its own paragraph and sometimes multiple paragraphs for a single claim. Because sometimes once you get started with a claim, you realize, oh no, this claim has to be split up into more than one paragraph. There's too much here. That's where the inspiration comes in. That's where the plan starts to change. And this is another reason why I really like chunking, because it allows you to do both at the same time. You're both making things up as you go along and planning as you go along, but you're not overly focused on style, structure, grammar, any of that kind of stuff. That stuff can be imposed a little bit later. So chunking is great for pantsers, for a pantser approach. There are a couple of other elements that you might want to look into when we're talking about chunking. Now, this right here is your basic paragraph structure. You can build on it if you're going to write a paragraph that's addressing counter arguments. In which case, where you would start out with your claim in a normal paragraph, in a counter argument paragraph, you would start out with a potential counterclaim. Somebody somewhere might argue against your position. So you want to, as unbiasedly as possible, address that counterclaim, give reasons why somebody might hold it, and then either concede to it or refute it and give your reasons for that. You could do that in a single paragraph, but that might have to be broken up into multiple paragraphs. Then there's an analysis paragraph when you're analyzing a text or an image or a movie. You have to look for certain patterns, certain elements that need to be taken out of the text and looked at closely and then interpreted. So, in an analysis paragraph, your claim is going to address the source or the element of the source to be analyzed. That could be language, that could be the imagery, that could be reasoning, that could be the facts or figures that a particular source presents. And your job is to analyze them within the context of the source and within the context of maybe a broader body of knowledge and see how it works, looking for patterns. Some of those patterns may be good patterns, some of them may be bad patterns. Some of them just may help you better understand whatever your issue or your topic is. But this is how you would write a paragraph like that. You would note the element of the source that you're analyzing. You would begin to look closely at that source by breaking it down, or at that element by breaking it down into its pieces and then interpreting it. And then you would explain, you would use quotes, you might draw in other sources, all of which is to help you interpret what you're seeing in that source. You would add additional clauses or sentences as needed, break it up into smaller paragraphs if need be. Here we've got a synthesis paragraph. So whereas analysis is looking at patterns, synthesis is looking at points of connection between different sources. In an analysis, you're noting it so that you can break it apart and figure out how it works, see the patterns of how it works. In a synthesis paragraph, you're noting that element so that you can connect it across sources. Possibly you found an element in one source that connects you to another source because they're using it maybe differently or talking about it differently. What do you learn about this by looking at both of these sources together? That's synthesis. In order to plan out a synthesis paragraph, you would note the element that you're trying to synthesize across sources. You would draw examples of that element from the different sources in order to analyze them. You'd analyze the source's use of that element, and then you would show the connections. That's your interpretation. You're going to now interpret it by showing how it's used across the different sources. And then, of course, you have a conclusion paragraph. And conclusions, basically all conclusions do the exact same thing. They sum up the themes that you've discussed. They reconnect the reader with the thesis statement, the importance of the issue that you're addressing, and then they provide a call to action. They want to leave the reader with a new understanding or a new way of approaching the problem or something that they want the reader to do. That's chunking. I think chunking has several strengths. It forces you to focus on space management. You are composing and planning kind of simultaneously. And so there's a little bit of organization going on, a little bit of composition going on all at the same time. This is why I think it's really good for pantsers. However, it does have its weaknesses. In a chunking outline, the map is not as clearly defined as you get in a traditional outline. The ideas may not be as clear in a chunked out plan as they are in a traditional outline. And you must have some overarching general sense of organization before you even start chunking things out. And this is part of the reason why chunking works so well with organizational schemes. There's a variety of organizational schemes that you can use in essay writing. Here I've provided a nice list of some of these, but you're often going to be asked to do summaries and analyses throughout your writing career. I'm only going to go over a few of these schema. I am not going to look at all of them because if I looked at all of them, this lecture would be far longer than it already is. So the four that I'm going to look at are the classical argument structure, the summary and response essay, the summary and analysis essay, and the analysis and synthesis essay. Basically, if you're writing in an academic setting, these four organizational schemes will get you through almost any writing assignment that you ever have to do. So let's start with classical argument structure. And the reason I want to start with the classical argument structure and the reason I like the classical argument structure so much is because the classical argument structure provides a structure that ensures your argument will do everything a good argument needs to do. Every good argument that you will ever write, every good essay that you will ever write should have all of these things in it. You should always explain and provide background for the issue that you're addressing. You should always provide proof, confirmatory proof and evidence and reasons for what you're arguing. You should always address counter arguments to some degree or another. The classical argument structure ensures that you do all of these things. So it's a great organizational scheme to just kind of keep in your back pocket if you have no other organizational scheme that you have been given. And you can see here how the classical argument structure kind of maps onto the modern essay structure. So in the modern essay, we have the intro, the body, and the conclusion. And in that intro, you have a thesis statement you're supposed to say. And you can see here how the pieces of the classical argument structure map onto those. I encourage you to research this more on your own. But if you look at this, this will give you a basic introduction to the classical argument structure. And it's a great structure to use in the absence of any other organizing scheme for an essay. Now, sometimes you're going to be asked to write a specific kind of essay. Summary and response essays are basically one of two types. They're either going to be critical or they're going to be laudatory. You're going to be looking at something and you're going to either say, this is really good, or this is really bad, or this has problems, but these are the good things. So there's an element of judgment in a response essay. You're going to have to look for points that you agree with, points that you disagree with. Sometimes this is referred to as reading with the grain and reading against the grain, looking for the strengths and the weaknesses of a particular text or a particular argument. But then on top of that, you're going to have to provide reasons. Why do you think these are strengths? Why do you think these are weaknesses? Why do you agree with those points and disagree with these other points? So here's an example of how you might organize a summary and response essay. You're going to have your introduction. It's usually going to be short and it's going to be followed by your thesis. Then you're going to have the next section. The very first section of your body is going to be the summary. You're going to have a detailed summary of your source. A good rule of thumb is not to go longer than a page with that summary. If a reader reads a summary of a source and they're asked to go longer than a page, they're going to wonder what you're doing. This is a trap that novice writers often fall into, is when they're asked to do summary and analysis or summary and response. Because summary is easier to write, they will often just focus on summary. I have a whole other series of videos on summary and analysis. You can go watch those on my YouTube page. But for our purposes, that rule of thumb is important. One paragraph, as detailed as you can get in no more than a page. Then you come into your actual response. And in a summary response essay, the response should take up the bulk of the essay. So if you've been asked to write a 2-page summary and response, you know that summary should be very short. The summary is only there so that the reader has a sense of what the original text is about, the text you're responding to is about, and a sense of the argument being made by that text. But the response, that's the reason the essay exists. And all you're going to be doing to organize that response section is breaking it down into the major points of your response. Like, what are the things that you liked about it? What are the things you disliked? What are the problems you had with it? What are the arguments that you might have agreed with or disagreed with? The reasoning you might have agreed with or disagreed with? And each of those will become a section of the text. Now, usually a summary response is going to be quite short, 2-3 pages long. So each section of your response is probably only going to be about a paragraph long. That goes back to chunking. Think in terms of the space that you have, right? Think in terms of how many claims can I make in this amount of space? And then, of course, you'll have your conclusion. You will briefly review the gist of the original source, briefly summarize the gist of your response, and then again, there's got to be some kind of something that you leave the reader thinking. You want to give a call to action. You want to connect back out to the reader's life, to the real world, the world outside the essay. Generally speaking, you're going to want the reader to integrate the thinking that you demonstrated in your response into their own thinking. This is how you now want them thinking about this source. So there's always going to be, in a summary or response, there's always going to be an element of persuasion at work. That's ultimately going to be the purpose. And you are working up to that climactic moment, that moment of persuasion. All right, let's look at the next organizational scheme, and that's summary and analysis. Now, the summary and analysis is very similar to the summary and response. Just rather than doing something critical or laudatory, you're approaching the text you're looking at analytically. So a response, there's some element of judgment, there's some element of what we might call opinion. Even if it's an objective opinion, it's some element of opinion. With an analysis, you're now looking at patterns. You want to point out patterns that you're seeing, and you want to interpret those patterns. That's the goal of analysis. These patterns can be patterns in language, patterns of persuasion. Uh, they could be patterns of logic. They could be um, patterns in terms of uh, the facts or the figures or the evidence that the source uses. Now, you can still talk in terms of strengths and weaknesses in an analysis. So I don't want you to think that judgment in an analysis is complete, or judgment is completely disconnected from analysis. But in an analysis, the judgment has to be objective. That means it just can't be your personal taste that you're appealing to. It has to um, appeal to shared criteria or values. And the judgment is not the goal of the analysis. The goal of the analysis is seeing how this source works and revealing that to your reader and then interpreting that to some degree. So, very similar to the summary and response, you're going to have an introduction and where you introduce uh, your topic or your theme or your issue. You have a very short, unbiased summary of the source, and then you go into your thesis statement, whatever the conclusions that you've come to through your analysis. Then you're going to have a summary paragraph, again, relatively short, and then you're going to have the body. And just like in the summary and response, that body will be broken down into sections based on the main points or the main findings of your analysis. And this is the distinction. Whereas in the response, these were your judgments about the source. In your summary and analysis, this is now your findings in the source. You have analyzed this to find something, to reveal something about the source. And these things that you've revealed in the source are going to be enumerated. These are going to be the major claims in the body of your analysis. And then you're going to have to defend those claims with evidence, with proofs, with quotes from the source, looking closely at certain sections of the source, examples from the source. Analysis is another one of those things that you need to learn how to do in order to write effectively in general, but especially within an academic setting. And so you can take a look at this and follow along with this organizational scheme for a basic analysis essay. But that leads us to the last of the organizational schemes that I'm going to be looking at, and that is the analysis and synthesis. If analysis is looking for patterns across an essay, you're pulling things out and looking at how the essay works by looking at patterns of evidence, patterns of strategies, patterns within the essay itself. Synthesis is where you take those things that you found in your analysis and you connect them to other sources. So in order to do a synthesis essay, you're going to have to analyze a series of essays and locate the points of connection. And then you make those points of connection clear for the reader and interpret what that means for the reader. The organization here is very similar to the organization of the summary, responses, summary, and analysis, but you've now added a section. So you'll have your introduction, you'll have your thesis statement, and then you'll have a section of summary. Just you summarize those sources that you've chosen. Now, there are basically two ways to do this. You can do a quick summary of all your sources and then go into the analysis of those sources. Or you can summarize, analyze, summarize, analyze, summarize, analyze. But that entire first section of your essay is building up to the synthesis. And the synthesis is the key section of your essay. This is where you bring all of your sources together and combine them by finding points of contact between them. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. One is you just have a section of synthesis where you explain how all of these, the new understanding that you've gained from reading all of these essays together. The other way that you can do this is to synthesize as you go. So you got your summary and analysis, and that will flow through synthesis into your next essay. I encourage you, I don't have time to go in depth into the differences between analysis and synthesis in this video. I'll have to do that in another video. But for our purposes, I would suggest that you go online, do some research on your own, look up the differences between analysis and summary and analysis and synthesis. I've got a couple of videos on these topics on my YouTube page. I encourage you to go to look at those, but there are lots of resources online for this as well. So we've now looked at 3 approaches to imposing order on your text: traditional outlining, chunking, and the use of organizational schemes. The last way to impose order on your text is what's known as reverse outlining. And this too is great for pantsers, because if you've already written something, you just sit down, you write your ideas out, you eventually have to go back and impose order on it. And reverse outlining is what this is all about. Once you've written the text, reverse outlining has you go back and look at that text paragraph by paragraph and look at everything that a text is supposed to have. Does each paragraph have a main theme or claim, something that says what the entire paragraph is about? If you find more than one claim, that's going to have to be separated. And this happens a lot with novice writers, and it happens especially with pantsers who just sit down to write stuff. So what you'll have is you'll have a full paragraph just full of claims, because you haven't really thought through why you think what you think. You're just writing down what you think. So pantsers will often discover that they'll have 2 or 3 paragraphs that are just claim, 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 claim. And they're making all these claims and they're not defending them. They're not developing them. There's no evidence to support them. You'll discover this when you reverse outline. And if you have a paragraph like that, those claims are going to have to be broken up. Now, you could ask yourself, why did I put these claims together? Like, what is it that makes all of these, what is it that made all of these feel like they were a coherent unit to me as I was writing? Because sometimes what you'll discover is that you just need to write a topic sentence, a claim that combines all of those claims together, and then just revise the paragraph. That does sometimes happen. And so you're going to have to figure out which situation you find yourself in. Is there a way that this paragraph can be made into a coherent paragraph? Or do these claims need to be split up and each one become its own claim? And there are a variety of ways to fix something like that. So I encourage you to go and look up some of these terms: coherence, paragraphing, sentence combining, cohesion. Look up some of these terms online. Do some exploring, do some study. But the goal is to make sure that each of these paragraphs is coherent, that everything in that paragraph belongs there. The next thing you do in reverse outlining, once you figure out what the point of that paragraph is you got to look at your evidence. Look at the reasons that you've provided your reader, or failed to provide your reader, for accepting that claim. And this is where you're going to start seeing whether or not your claim has merit. Do you have enough evidence to support your claim? Do you have enough reason to support your claim? If you have that, you want to list it out when you're reverse outlining, because this will give you your map of your ideas. If you don't have it, now you know it's missing, and you know what you need to go and find to make this a more effective argument. You will want to look at transitions too as you're reverse outlining. Is there a sense of flow between these paragraphs? Um, but the big thing that you're on the lookout for here is the patterns. So you're now analyzing your own text, trying to find the patterns and the themes that stick out, because it's in finding those patterns and themes that you'll be able to organize your text into sections. Sometimes when you're pantsing it, when you just sit down and you start writing, you'll find that at one point in your text you wrote something and then you almost wrote the same thing a little bit later because you're still working your ideas out. Well, those two paragraphs, while they might show up very far apart in what you've written, they may be belong together. And so this is the point at which you have to decide, does this go here or does it go there? And reverse outlining can help you do that as you go through paragraph by paragraph and you start noting the themes and the patterns in your thinking. This will help you know what pieces of your thinking belong together. And then you can start organizing your essay. I don't want you to think of these four basic ways of organizing as separate magisteria, right? Like these are not separate entities. These are strategies. And if you have all of these strategies at your disposal, you can mix and match them as you need to, right? Experiment with them, see what works and see what doesn't work for you. And it's not always going to be the same stuff that works. You're going to find in some instances pantsing works, and in some instances planning works. And sometimes you're going to do both of them together. Sometimes you're going to start out with a chunking exercise, and you're going to end up with a traditional outline. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So keep in mind that these are approaches to writing. And if you approach writing as a process and you approach all of these different things that I've given you as strategies to implement in your writing, then you'll find that you can mix and match and at different times, at different points in the writing process, and even at different times in your life, different strategies are going to work because they will appeal to where you are at that moment. So the goal is to practice them all, experiment, see what works for you. You're still developing as a writer. You haven't figured out probably what works for you yet. And so if you're a novice writer, you need to experiment with that. And once you discover things that work for you, you go with that stuff that works for you. Whatever assignment you're working on, whatever writing situation you find yourself in, these planning strategies, these organizing strategies can help you to impose order on your thoughts. And it's by imposing order on your thoughts that you can actually connect with a reader and with an audience. Your ideas, no matter how eloquently expressed, are going to suffer in communication if you cannot impose order on your thoughts. Anyway, I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.